All right, I'm going to start now. My task today is quite modest and simple. It's basically to introduce and welcome all of you all to the event. My name is Mrna and I'm from CCLS. I'm the Deputy Director of Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute, and we're really pleased that we're doing this joint event with Global Health Initiative from the London School of Economics. And the event really is to talk about a book. The title is in the event itself, That High Design of Purest Gold, which basically is a critical history of the pharmaceutical industry from 1880 to 2020. And apparently written by Graham Dutfield during the lockdown, which makes us all feel very good about what we did during the lockdown. And it is a critical discussion. It really is quite a good book, I would say, if you wanted to understand the interplay of politics and economics and law and even the science in the medicines area. And while it is a critical history, I think at the end of the day, as one reviewer says, and I can do no better than to cite him, there are no real villains here, just actors responding to incentives that have increasingly misaligned financial reward and legal strategy from public health outcomes. And to discuss whether or not that is true and whether there are villains or not, we have a spectacular panel, and I'm just briefly going to state who they are. First of all, we have Dr. Paul Fellner, who is, from Exceller Health. He's the Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Officer at Exceller Health. And he was also previously the head of IP from Novartis Pharma, which is based in Switzerland. We also have Buju Kilish, who is the Research Director for Public Citizens Access to Medicines Program. And welcome back again to this event, because Buju, of course, an alumnus from Queen Mary. We have Ken Chaplin, who is a Professor of Development Studies at the London School of Economics. And both him and Buju have written in this area in relation to pharmaceutical innovation and patents in the post-TRIPS world in developing countries, and in Ken's case, especially in Latin America. And finally, but totally not leastly, Shiva Tambiceti, who is an associate professor of law at the London School of Economics, who has published a lot on IP and health and emerging technologies. So we're going to start with Graham, who's going to explain a bit about the book and the thesis of the book, and then we'll go through the panel. So over to you, Graham.
Thanks so much, Shuma. I'd like to thank LSE and, of course, Queen Mary for organising this event. I'm going to share my screen now. And if you can't see this, Uma, please give me a shout.
It's good.
To move the camera so that I can see the slideshow. It's in the way. Where do I get to the slideshow? Here we go. Okay. The usual. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the book and address the question that's there in the title. All right. So so my book tells a history of the modern pharmaceutical industry, which, from my perspective, emerged 140 years ago, and how it's evolved since then, and what it all means to us. So much has changed, and yet so much has stayed the same, as we'll see. The book tells, a lot of small stories about how medicines, some of which have changed the world, were discovered, developed, and delivered. Some of these stories are quite heroic, others perhaps quite a lot less so. Some of my favourites are captured in these images. On the left is a chap called Carl Link, who's largely forgotten now, but Carl Link and his team turned an insight into about a livestock disease's causes due to cattle eating spoiled clover, that led his thinking to the development of a rat poison based on the isolated molecule from that clover. And then in turn, by way of a failed suicide attempt, and you have to read the book to find out the details of this, it turned into a drug called warfarin, which of course is a very important medicine still used today, about 100 years later, to treat thrombosis and other cardiovascular problems. On the right is Frederick Banting, of course, of insulin fame, and one of his unfortunate lab dogs. I'll say nothing about what happened to that dog. And in the middle, you have, this is the penicillin team at Oxford. Okay, so these are great stories, and it's important, of course, though, not to over-individualize medical discovery and not to focus exclusively on the men. Actually, women were often in the labs as well. They didn't necessarily feature in the photographs or the Nobel Prize winning lists. Pharmaceutical innovation, though, actually, these people aside, is all really about networks, teams, and teams of teams, typically ones working in different places, nowadays even on opposite sides of the world, and at the same and at different times. And ironically, what we might, another story learned from history is that at certain times, what we might now condemn as piracy was actually a patriotic duty at the time during the First World War, when copying German drugs was part of the war effort. So this is piracy, you might say, but on the other hand, it was seen rather differently in those days, needs must. So much has been written by academics on the pharmaceutical industry, a lot of it highly critical. And some of these books criticize companies for illegal behavior. Well, I want to do something a bit different. First, I love history anyway. I wanted it to be a history book, but also I wanted to focus on things that they did that are legal, not illegal. Because the consequences of not breaking the law are enough for me that of interest without going into corporate crime. So one of the main premises of my book is that if you want to understand something in the here and now, it really helps to know how we got here. So I trace the origins of the industry back to the 1880s. It's not actually easy to figure out when one can say the modern pharmaceutical industry, as we know it today, came into existence. There'd be pharmacies, other businesses making products claiming health benefits for hundreds, if not thousands of years and all over the world. But until recently in historical terms, there were no drug companies in the way we understand now, no Pfizers, no Novartises. So the industry really starts in the 19th century once the idea of purified molecules presented in standardized form became reality and was seen as being the most perfect way to treat a sick person. If there's an origin to this notion, we could say it came from France in the 19th century, and French, and especially German chemists later, then made this a reality and turn this principle into industrial production. In time, the rest of the world joined in. But note that Europe didn't do it all by itself. It built on medical traditions from most of the world's continents. Scientists learned much from travels to the tropics and talking to local people there and collecting plants in those places which hundreds or thousands of years of human use were recorded. And this new industry wasn't fully science-based at first, but the businesses did find ways to make money that proved to be enduring. Patents, trademarks, marketing, and the other persuasive arts, all done in a systematic way and at times quite aggressively. The industry's basic profit-making, the activities themselves haven't changed all that much in 140 years, making them, I would say, a defining feature of the industry. But a great deal obviously has changed, and regulation, of course, has been completely transformed, and the strategies used to make money are perhaps not so much. So my subject isn't just the pharmaceutical industry itself and the regulatory and legal frameworks in which the industry sits, but the science and technology that creates new business opportunities and hindrances when these encounter bottlenecks. And of course, the business imperatives and the strategies industry employs. So here we have, four, you might say, four overlapping and mutually evolving elements. So what are these? Science, business, regulation, and law. When one of these changes, evolves meaningfully, all of them change, and so on. It's complex, but it's useful to see history in this context through a co-evolutionary lens of these four elements. Hence my borrowing the term from biology. Doing so is also helpful, I think, prescriptively. If we want to make things better, we have to look at all four and see how they interact. And therefore, it's also somewhat so predictive as well. If you do change this, these other things can then happen. Maybe it's a space perhaps for scenario planning. So for its successes, in my opinion, the industry doesn't perform as well as it could. Of course, we all want more of the treatments for the biggest public health problems and at prices enabling all who need them to benefit from them. For me, unaffordably isn't an option, or it shouldn't be an option. The idea that a life-saving drug can't be taken because it costs too much. Somehow I feel we can't accept this morally. We have to do something about it. Notice I use the word we, right? Not they, but we. It's something that we all have to think about, not just but all the responsibility on one particular industry is important as they are. Okay, so drugs are simply not like other products. So, of course, industry is in the business of making profit, and of course, it does need to make profit so it can keep on investing in research and development. So what can, again, we do to make the industry work better? It seems to me that tweaks here and there can never sort of be the answer. They can help. And this point is clear as a clear inference for my co-evolutionary approach, and I'll come back to this towards the end. So one thing that makes recent decades different is the full acknowledgement of the regulatory implications of what's been known for a very long time. And what we know for a very long time, that drugs are poisons. The difference between a drug and a poison is the dose, and I might also say the context as well. A starting illustration of this ambiguity is a drug called thalidomide, a word that strikes horror in people of my generation, because I actually remember, having children from social school came to my classes, and boys with no arms and legs, and they were, so this drug, extremely powerful, was prescribed initially in Europe to many pregnant mothers suffering from morning sickness. 5 years after the drug had been approved, by then in nearly 50 countries, scientists in 1961 found a link between the drug and incidences of babies born with numerous disabilities, some quite horrific. It's hard to imagine a more visually and psychologically shocking adverse drug reaction for families as well. And yet the product, this is the thing, the product is still available for the treatment of numerous cancers and skin conditions. But as you can maybe see in the box here, there is a severe warning that the drug cannot be taken by pregnant women or those who could become pregnant. The scandal explains why regulation was tightened up so much in Europe from that time onwards. I mean, Germany had very little regulation in terms of safety up to that time. It also points to the very high stakes involved in drug approvals. Suffice it to say, the moment that the modern drug regulatory complex has market-shaping effects, subjecting industry to constraints, including market barriers, but also creating opportunities that can benefit existing companies that become experienced in using the system. So how does the industry make money, and how does this affect all of us? Well, I divide this part of my talk into 4 parts. 1 is motivations, 2 challenges, 3 responses, and 4 social consequences. So the first one, motivations. This is easy to deal with, essentially to maximize the profits. Shareholder value, as in other industries, maximizing shareholder value is important, seen as a raison d'etre of industry. I'm not sure if it necessarily should be, but that's the way it is nowadays. Challenges, just a few of these to mention. There's a need to satisfy shareholders and investors. Large corporations, just move on a bit. Large corporations tend to be conservative. is often said, slow to change. Small companies often spun out of universities, are more innovative, but lack the money to get their products to market. So it might be that the money is there and the innovation is there. Of course, there are ways to resolve this, right? So it's not insurmountable. Also, pharmaceutical R&D is expensive and risky, and there are massive failure rates. Another challenge is unpredictability and variability in patient response, especially in complex diseases lacking precisely pinpointed and well understood molecular targets. It's really hard. Next, and this is something that I heard from Professor Chaplin at Oxford University. He said that he highlighted what he saw as a big problem of lack of transparency, which makes it harder for companies to learn from other companies' failures. There is, he said, widespread duplication, hence a massive wastage of time and money. And he said people don't publish their failures. Next, from the perspective of industry, others may see it differently, but from industry, another challenge is unharmonized regulations and IP laws in overseas markets. And then lastly of these list is the temporary nature of market exclusivity and generic market entry where unfettered will lead to lower prices. So responses. Well, of course, industry reaches outside the company. It builds collaborative networks, which can potentially cross national boundaries, actually go around the world. Open innovation. I met Paul at a conference years ago on open innovation, and which show that industry is sort of like doing this very large scale networking, which is really quite interesting. Companies will also explore and apply new technologies, methods, and ideas, but note, as I said, the conservatism of some of the large firms. It is often alleged. Perhaps more critically, there is the accusation that industry tends to play it safe a bit too much, that incremental innovations exploiting and expanding already existing product niches rather than creating new ones. The tendency to target chronic conditions that require repeated use, possibly even lifetimes use, rather than cures for diseases where drug usage would be short-term, because after you're cured, you wouldn't take it anymore. And then, very controversially, the product life cycle management practices taking advantage, so I need to go a bit faster with my changing slides, the product life cycle management practices that take advantage of IP rights and regulatory exclusivities to create and extend monopolies on existing drugs that inhibit generic market entry or shift consumers onto similar but new products from the same company that may not necessarily be much or any better. So in terms of social consequences, I'm going to take a half glass empty view here, because I don't have time for the glass half full, because otherwise it will cut me off. So let's look at the bad stuff. This is not to say there isn't any good stuff. Okay, so astronomically high prices on some drugs. I mean, wildly high prices sometimes. There is neglect of therapeutic areas that are considered not to be profitable, even though social welfare benefits would be enormous. I mean, we have antibiotics as a big problem with resistance to drug resistance. Also, obviously, tropical diseases, diseases of the poor get neglected. Other consequences are the restraint of competition by such practices as secondary patenting, protecting trademarks covering pills, shapes, colours and slogans rather than just names has potentially an inhibitory effect as well. So, and also regulatory gaming. And this is a really big thing in the United States from what I've read. I read the work of Robin Feldman, who's written about this very well, taking, you might say, anti-social advantage of loopholes or weaknesses in regulatory regimes to acquire undue or excessive exclusivities, such as through orphan drug regulations. That was one comes up quite a bit. And then harmful access and availability outcomes arising from effective lobbying of governments, including developing country governments, to adopt developed country laws and regulations extending effective drug exclusivities. Okay, so let's answer the question, is the industry working? Actually, let's look at what appears to be an unequivocal success story, which is Gleevec, which I've been looking at for a few years. I did once talk very briefly to Nicholas Lydon, who was involved in the whole process of coming up with Gleevec. This is commonly regarded as one of the truly great modern precision drugs. It's for a particular form of leukemia called chronic myeloid leukemia. Now, we'll put to one side the fact that Gleevec was a result of research carried out in numerous locations, not just in Basel. But in 2001, this medicine was first approved in the US and was priced in that country at $2,000 to $4,000 per patient per month. Quite a lot of money, but it's something that that the industry could charge because it's the United States and that's possible, but also because it was a lifesaver. There were no alternatives. So it was a genuine sort of monopoly. It was the first in class of that type of drug. But note that orphan drug status is really for rare disease treatments that could never be highly profitable without regulatory assistance. And when you look at the whole picture, it's hard to see that Novartis really needed this help. Within 2 years, Gleevec had reached $1 billion in annual sales, and this sum increased thereafter. From 2002 to 2006, Gleevec was approved for 8 additional rare medical indications, also orphan drug status, generating more sales and more regulatory exclusivities. To many people, and myself included, great medicine as it is, it seems as if Novartis was over-rewarded by the regulatory system. It didn't really need that amount of reward. I should note in passing that Brian Drucker from the United States, one of the public sector scientists involved in Gleevec, went to quite a lot of effort to persuade Novartis that there is a market in this product. They were quite reluctant to actually sell it. Okay, so there are success stories. I won't go into this because I don't have enough time and who's going to cut me off in 5 minutes or 4 minutes.
Actually, you ran out of time 3 minutes ago.
Thank you very much. But you'll give me a couple of minutes, won't you? Because you're such a kind-hearted person. So is it time we start to think about improving the regulatory system and devising alternative innovation models? I won't say too much about this because I think Paul at least is going to talk about my chapter 10 anyway, or somebody's going to. But I think so, and I think we need to better understand this interactive co-evolutionary relationship between those 4 phenomena I mentioned, showed in the earlier slide, including also business strategy, et cetera, and the regulatory system. We need to adopt this holistic approach rather than a piecemeal approach, although piecemeal approaches can certainly help. I won't say too much more, and I'll finish in a couple of minutes just to say first, to underline the points made earlier, the industry, in my view, can't be relied on to provide all the health solutions we need at the prices that can be afforded. The blame lies not so much with the industry, but with misaligned, inflexible, and maladaptive regulatory and innovation systems. Admittedly, industry has been very much involved in shaping those systems, and to that extent, we can certainly blame them for that. But we can't have a better industry until we fix or fine-tune these 4, what I just said. As a keen user of biological analogies, I want to end by saying we need to take an ecosystems approach, not a reductionist one that looks at this or that factor. It's not a patent problem, a regulatory problem, or a business problem. It's all of those. And let me just finish by the last paragraph of my book, which seems a nice way to close what I was saying. And as those of you who've written books will know, writing the last paragraph is the hardest paragraph to write in the book. This is what I said. Perhaps this says as much as I said in the last 20 minutes. And finally, it remains for me to say the following. It is probably hard for any of us to think of anything nobler than presenting to the world a new medicine that saves many lives. That high design of purest gold as an old tribute on the wall of an ancient London church put it rather beautifully. But there's much more and less to the industry than high design or purest gold. And making the most beautiful medicine is all well and good, but if people who need it cannot get it, for economic or other reasons, it might as well not exist. This book's title purposely reflects these contradictions. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham, for that very cogent summary of the book. If not, you did go out of time, yeah. But I thought I'd be kind today. But next we have Dr. Shiva Tambiceti from LSE. And if I could ask Shiva to come on. And if you could mute yourself, Graham, thanks.
Hi, Uma, thank you. Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you both to Uma and Graham for inviting me to speak a little bit about the book. I'm going to start with a little vignette about Graham. I've known Graham for more than 2 decades, less than 3 decades. And if I'm not giving too many clues away about my age, I met Graham first at the University of Oxford, where I just arrived as a lowly third-year law student from India. My brother won a radio competition and was given 2 return tickets to India. And he was a student at Oxford at the time, and he very kindly lent me one of the tickets. And I just begun reading about the Human Genome Project. And I wrote to Darrell Posey, who was at the time running the Traditional Resource Rights program at Oxford, saying, can I come and speak to him, and would I be able to access any materials and information? And Darrell was very generous. I arrived and I met him, I spoke to him, and he said, my research assistant will take care of you. We have a library at the Oxford Center for Environment, Ethics and Society. That's where I ended up. I went to, I think it was in Mansfield College, in a little attic room that barely had head height. And in the midst of this tiny cubicle, you could find Graham, surrounded by books and papers and reports that he had collected and was curating on behalf of the Traditional Resource Rights Program. It might seem trivial in these days of information overload, but the amount of information that Graham had collected in that room was really extraordinary, and he was incredibly generous. I could take anything I wanted, I could copy anything I wanted, and if he had duplicates of reports, he handed one over to me. And I can genuinely say that I was, but for Graham's generosity at that time, I probably would not have embarked on my doctorate. And I've known Graham since then, and I've seen how devoted he is to his students, and how he is always, every time I've heard him speak, he's pushed holistic perspectives on legal issues. And I think this book is entirely true to that generosity of spirit. What I found in this book is there's a great deal of concern for the reader. There are no assumptions made about what the reader may or may not know and how they might be coming to the topic. There's a great deal of information that allows the reader to position themselves as they go along. And I think that speaks a lot about the care and attention to detail that Graham has put into this book. So brings me to the book itself, all 525 pages of it. I think in recent times, there's a lot of shorthanded reasoning around the pharmaceutical industry and an assumption of what is in the public interest or the malefides of the industry itself. And I may have been guilty of indulging in it occasionally myself. Given my observation of Graham's scholarship and his talks and workshops that I've attended where he's spoken, I possibly came to this book imagining I would know what it said. I thought I'd have a fairly good idea of what he would be talking about, but I found the book to be very surprising. Graham's starting point is that neither an alignment nor a non-alignment can be presumed between powerful organized interest groups and what we end up in terms of the regulation and the shape of the law and policy around the pharmaceutical industry. And this, I think, is a value of what Graham has so well put as a co-evolutionary approach. He's managed to show in this book with a great deal of detail the sort of mutual adaptation between policymaking and what happens in the ground, between the labs, the corporations, and the marketplace. So with this sort of introduction, I want to talk about 6 points. I'll be very quick. I'm cheating a little bit because my first point has about 5 or 6 subsets to it. The reason I find, and I want to talk about these 6 points, is that I looked at the book from the perspective of what could I use in it, in my own scholarship. And I found these sorts of 6 takeaways or take-home messages, if you like, to be particularly useful. And I would say here that I think one of the greatest contributions of this book, Graham, if you will, is that it is going to be mined, I think, for years by scholars. There are many different perspectives that one might take while approaching this book, and law is by no means the only one. But as an IP lawyer, I found these 6 points particularly interesting. So this idea of market making and how law and regulation and the market sort of make and form each other is very powerfully laid out. It's a really complex narrative, but I think the way you've positioned the examples and position the shorter histories within the longer arc of the history of the industry, I think works really well. Some examples, your discussion of how technical higher education in Germany contrasted with British Industrial Revolution that was led mostly by individuals, I thought was really fascinating. And drawing from that, this idea that innovation in process as a research strategy and product diversity as a marketing strategy, that to me speaks directly to patent law and how patent law evolved. So it's very pleasing to have this wealth of information at hand. The rise of documentation on safety and efficacy, forming a sort of quasi-intellectual property right in itself, I think, again, is a story that's quite powerfully told. We know from IP, for instance, that there is a dynamic of property begets property, that property owners tend to amplify their rights using the resources available to them. And I find that the juxtaposition of regulation with IP tells that story very nicely in the book. I found the social construction of value in science really interesting. And I think full credit to you for choosing the right stories. I found the discussion of insulin, for instance, really quite exciting in terms of the layers of meaning that you could draw from that. But what I took away from how you presented the social construction of value in science that makes sense to me was about how patents grew as a proxy for value. If it was patentable, it was valuable. If it was not patentable, it's not valuable. And I think this has led directly to a sort of delinking between money and morality. Just because you're making money doesn't mean you are immoral. And I think that's the sort of embedded in the patent system, the sort of celebration of self-interest by creating value because we all benefit from that celebration of self-interest. I found that story to be quite compelling in your description. I have a couple of quibbles here. I think there are places where the industry's own view is taken in a very uncritical way. So for instance, I'd say there are a few passages where you discuss the Bolar exemption and the patent term extension is cancelling itself out. And obviously that's an industry view. And I would, take that with more than a pinch of salt, because, it's not a zero-sum game. The Bolar exemption is speaking to the research use exception and the need to keep innovation going. Whereas the patent term extension is trying to compensate for a different kind of loss. So at places I would probe those industries' self-image of what it was trying to do more carefully. I also thought that the sort of mixing of regulation IP, in my view, was interesting. But I think IP has its own dynamics, because by creating a property right, the system creates quite a powerful loss aversion dynamic. Once you have a property right, you want to do everything not to lose that property right, which does not apply to regulation. And I think there are places where I feel there's a missing link to the story, because there is this dynamic that property owners will try to ring fence or amplify the exclusivity given by the patent. I think it does come out really nicely in the way you discuss regulation, but I wondered if that dynamic playing out in patents could have been made, maybe you could have made more of that. So that's my first point. I'll go very quickly through 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I really enjoy the discussion on naming. I think as an IP lawyer, we tend to be quite protective of our domains. A patent lawyer may not discuss trademarks, and a trademark lawyer may not discuss copyright. But the sort of controlling the boundary between sameness and difference, and how the industry has used that as a way to make value in the marketplace. I think it's a really compelling story, told really well, because you're not constrained by these boundaries of, is it trademark or is it patents? And I really enjoyed reading that aspect. The social construction of disease and medicine, again, the fact that, the creation of insulin, for instance, and the sort of the construction of, insulin as a medicine for a disease. Now, of course, we've seen this social construction with medical use claims, where legal frictions create both a category of invention and a category of medical treatment, where manufacture of medicament is key to patentability. So the sort of mirroring of that social construction in science and in sort of in the life sciences, I think was interesting. And I think, there's a lot there that I could draw from in future work. I will cut down one point and I have 2 more points to make. I found the term biodigital convergence really interesting. And, if we have time for Q&A, I might like to hear a little bit more about that. This idea that the social construction of value, molecular biology, not as it exists in the idealized world, but how it actually exists and performs in science communication, legal practice, or policy making, I think is really quite compelling. There's a really compelling story there about what we are missing by taking a sort of rhetorical performance of technology over and above what we really value, what we ought to value, what is socially desirable, etc. I think that term really nicely conveys the gap that we should be filling. So this brings me to my final point. When I teach copyright law, there's this interesting idea that when you look at infringement and the copyright work, you don't selectively present those elements of the copyright work that would make it more likely for you to find infringement. And I think, Graham, what you've done really well in this book is you've avoided presenting just those elements of the industry that make it more likely for us to see the industry as a bad actor. By presenting this sort of huge arc, 140 years of history, you managed to present the story in totality. And you do look for patterns and structures, but you avoid making assumptions about the malafidis of those patterns and structures, which I think is useful, because I think it's a sort of work that we sorely lack in this field. And I can see this being used for years, to produce, to grow on, to sort of grow the ideas that you've presented. So my final point is just to go back, taking off from your notion in the last chapter about public interest, I'd like to go back to this question. So why do we not get the industry we deserve? I would say that we do get the industry we deserve, and we deserve this industry because what you've so well shown in the book is there's an amoral growth of law and regulation. We privilege individual initiative and the heroic inventor. We amplify the exclusivity of property rights with these layered regulations. We allow momentary self-interest, self-interest that is historic, that ought to be reserved to a certain point in time. We allow that self-interest to become a proxy for value. We don't pay attention to all the incremental ways in which we socially construct disease, health, and medicine. And therefore, I would say, and as Graham has so well evidenced in this book, we do end up with precisely the pharmaceutical industry that we deserve.
Thank you, Shiva. That was lovely, especially the stories. But thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly hand it over now to Paul Fellner, who probably has something to say about whatever Graham said about Novartis, having worked there for some time. Over to you, Paul.
Yes. Well, first thing I should say is thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the launch event today. It's a real honor for me to be not just a participant but also a speaker here. So appreciated that, and it was a great opportunity to read a book which I think will become a standard in the field for its scope, both historically, and I think context is such a critically important part of approaching a problem. And for its breadth, it covers a tremendous amount of space, from the fundamental technology to the business evolution to the geopolitical economic schemes that rose up. And picking up from Shiva's point, I think it's not whether we have the pharmaceutical industry we deserve. I think it's we have the pharmaceutical industry that we've created. And I think what Graham's book does a great job showing is this notion of co-evolution, that nothing develops in a vacuum, even though you will get the characterization, to pick up another point that Shiva made, the sort of individual springing forth from the head of Zeus with Gleevec or valsartan or any of a number of other really important medicines. All of these things are part of a whole, and I would strongly encourage taking that lesson as a starting point for how to address it, and we'll get to that. But the point that I took, and let me just say that this is a point taken from my particular vantage, and not necessarily what was intended, but for me it was very clearly there. Is not only was it a kind of a co-evolution, but a co-evolution of paradox. And I use paradox very specifically here, which is the situation where two seemingly contradictory states actually support each other and strengthen each other. And the consequence of paradox is it becomes very difficult to undo the individual states, because they're so interconnected. Addressing one will result in bolstering by the other. And so you kind of need to think about how to address these paradoxical situations more concretely. And so where did I see that from the book? First of all, this notion of co-evolution. And if there's some remarkable literature now about ecosystems in general, and how in the context of co-evolution, seemingly competitive species are actually also collaborative. They build on each other. And I've been reading about this in particular with respect to forests. And forests are remarkably strong as ecosystems because the evergreen trees feed the deciduous trees during the winter and vice versa in the summer. The dying plants release carbon to the forest floors that can be shared by all the other plants that are there. The aged trees shade and protect the new seedlings, not only of their own species, but of others. And so we see the paradoxes that Graham has developed as a result of this coevolution, and realize we have a high barrier to changing this. Now, what are some of these paradoxes that came out of the book? I think a really important one is the fact that we're taking poisons to treat illnesses. I mean, that's an incredibly fundamental paradox that I think was developed early and lays a foundation for thinking about everything that happens subsequently. We take poison to treat our conditions. Now, we, of course, take it very carefully in measured amounts. And a lot of the development of the pharmaceutical industry is just that, figuring out how to properly titrate the poison to treat the underlying illness. There's the paradox of high regulation and profitability. And this is a paradox that lawyers understand super well, because by creating high barriers to entry, we protect our racket tremendously and are able to extract a lot of value from society as a consequence. And in fact, this is what happens in the industry. And a lot of these regulations are, as Graham points out throughout the book, absolutely essential. We simply couldn't tolerate the situation where there was no basis to rely on manufacturing quality. I know I could not possibly go to a manufacturing plant, even though I've been in the industry for, tangentially or directly 30 years, and ascertain whether the manufacturing line was producing a high quality material. And it would be absurd to think that every patient about to take a drug would have that responsibility. So it's really important that we have manufacturing requirements, but those create significant barriers to entry. We've seen this in the context of COVID-19 and the calls for tech transfer sharing. Well, you could share all the tech transfer in the world. You're still months or years away from bringing another manufacturing facility online that meets the quality standards that the health authorities require for products to be made. We have the paradox of science and business. Science, which purports to be very objective, although I would posit that objectivity in science only results after years of challenging and testing and evaluating reproducibility of observations. Initial observations are, like every other human endeavor, influenced by what the researcher is trying to achieve and how they're trying to achieve it. But science does arrive at a truth eventually, whereas business is a purely creation of human ingenuity. It's imaginary, frankly. I always forget his name. The guy who wrote Homo Deus and Sapiens points out the joint stock company is a figment of our imagination. It's a joint figment of our imagination, and consequently a very powerful figment of our imagination, but imaginary nonetheless. On the other hand, gravity is no figment of the imagination. It's a basic physical fact. And the function of biology is the same. But you have this balance of the subjectivity of business, of trying to drive for profitability, of trying to pursue the avenues that are most they're going to produce the most return on invested capital. Why is that? Because that's what the investors are asking for. And that is the coevolution of the pharmaceutical industry within the business environment. It is, frankly, and oddly treated in many respects, if not most, as just another business. And if we want to change that, we'll have to undo both elements of that paradox. There's the paradox that the factors that support the industry also hamper it. And I think Graham made a great point here in terms of how intellectual property, for example, and I use this term broadly, not just to include the patents and trademarks, which are critically important, of course, to maintaining competitive barriers, but the trade secrets, the confidential information, the confidentiality agreements, the sort of private intellectual property agreements that are entered into that protect the technology that an individual company develops from general knowledge. And this cannot help but have the impact of slowing down competitors. That is the intention of the broad intellectual property regime, slowing down competitors. That means we are delaying the development of medicines. And who gets hurt by this? The companies do fine because they increase their profitability. The patients, not so much. They're waiting extra months or years, and possibly, because of the reasons that are brought out in the book, if there's no hope of incentives, not just patents, but incentives in general, products may never be developed or never be redeveloped for patients. This is a weird situation whereby by slowing itself down, the industry extracts more profit from society, but that is not a healthy sort of paradox situation in my view. There's one that's even trickier, and I liked how kind of Graham brought this up at the beginning. He didn't write a book about the illegality of the pharmaceutical industry, the things they do wrong, and there's plenty, because like every human endeavor, humans will push the boundaries and frankly, happily walk over them if they think they can with impunity. It is the legality, but immorality of what the industry does. And this is a very strange situation. And I personally actually have a lot of problems with holding somebody to account for things that were legal because they're deemed to be immoral. Instead, I think you've got to try to shift the legal ground. And it's something I would really suggest is also shift the business ground. And I'll get to what I mean by that now, because I want to wrap up. I know there's people with really interesting things to say after me, and I want to give them plenty of time. So what is it that looking at chapter 10 of Graham's book, I think the important lesson from that is that although intellectual property is important, and this harks to one of his final slides, it in of itself is neither the cause nor a sufficient solution to the issues that we have in the biopharmaceutical industry. Indeed, I would suggest that the intellectual property regime is incredibly powerful and also self-correcting. And what it does mean, though, is if you don't like somebody's intellectual property right, you do have the burden of challenging it, which is a more difficult burden, but a more sensible one than just eliminating it, just by fiat saying, well, that right doesn't exist anymore. And why is that important? Because sometimes incremental innovation is critically important. And to mention a Novartis product, there was one called Neoral, which was a microemulsion suspension of cyclosporin. Now, cyclosporin was an important drug to suppress organ transplant rejection, but it had a very narrow therapeutic window. It was very easy to overdose the patient, causing toxicity, or underdose the patient, resulting in organ rejection. Both of those outcomes highly undesirable after especially the time and expense of organ transplantation. Well, by taking this drug, which is now old, and formulating it in a microemulsion, the predecessor of Novartis was actually able to expand that therapeutic window. Now it was harder to overdose and harder to underdose. And I have to submit that although an incremental invention, that's a really important one. And so if we attack all patents by class, we run the risk of disincentivizing important inventions. What I think we need to do, taking Graham's points at the end of the book of finding ways outside the patent system, encourage open source development. And this is a huge miss for the reasons that Graham brought out in his book and that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It slows everything down. And it's not unfair to ask the regulator to make a cost of approval, which is up to billions of dollars of windfall, to make your technology available. Right now, approval doesn't includes all the clinical data, and that could be referenced later. But the manufacturing information is still confidential. It's not made available. The cell lines are not made available. Now, these things are necessary but not sufficient to creating competitive products, but it would sure be a lot faster if there was a mechanism to make them available, as Graham points out. Thinking about how to remunerate in proportion to impact. Although I would caution about this, because I think, frankly, the price of a product not only should reflect the good it does, but also what it cost to create and what it costs to make on a daily basis. And I'm actually working for a company that I've co-founded on a product for a rare genetic disease that is a staple of the pharmaceutical industry. It's a molecule called cyclodextrin. It's used as an excipient, as a solubilizing agent in many drug products. The other solutions to this particular genetic disease would be gene therapy. Now, if you just took the benefit to the patient, I should charge, I think the price for Zolgensma is $2 million. The price for the, I forget the name of the ophthalmic drug, is on the order of $1 million. $1 million for a product that probably costs, $100 to $1,000 a year just to manufacture. Is that what we should be doing? No, I think we've got to include all of the factors, not just the impact. And that's where I think maybe the KEI solution that's listed in the book of delinking is important. But ultimately, I think we've got to look, frankly, because this is the world, at the money flows. And I think we've got to look at the biggest money flow. And where is that? It's the payers, right? The ones buying the products. That is the biggest money flow, because the cost of development is a fraction of that. The cost of running the company, the G&A, is a fraction of that. The cost of marketing and sales, the dirty little secret of the pharmaceutical industry that is well brought out in this book, is a fraction of that. And if the moneyed interests would combine to demand a shift in this co-evolutionary process, I think that would have a huge impact. And that's possible if those pension funds that Graham talked about would invest on the basis of intention and impact instead of return on invested capital, and find those companies, and they exist, that are committed to a solution first with profits to follow. We could shift the market, because now it's not only top-down governmental forcing or changes, which, by the way, as Graham well points out, doesn't work in the United States because the money goes to the legislature to avoid any harsh things. Well, what you can't avoid is real competition. What you can't avoid are the companies that are offering a better product at a lower price. You've got to respond to that competition. Now, you could try to pay off your legislators to make that approach illegal, and that's where finding the right concentration of the other interests that are part of this co-evolutionary process is critically important. So I thank Graham for the opportunity to talk today. I thank Graham for the stimulation and thinking that his book inspired in me. And I yield the floor back to my colleagues who will share other information, and apologize if I've gone over because I forgot to check the time.
Thanks for that. Very cogent remarks, and really quite interesting as well about the money flow. I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Burcu Kilic from Public Citizens Access to Medicines program. And I think Burcu has very strong views on this topic.
I am the advocate in the panel, so I have strong views. Okay, this is amazing. It's so good to be back at home, because Queen Mary is like a home for me. And if you don't know me, you should know that, I am where I am because of these amazing people, both Graham, Uma, and I also see familiar names in the audience. Duncan Spiros, hi. It's so great to be back here. And Shiva started with her personal story, and she talk about that young Indian girl and how she met Graham. So I'm going to start with my personal story, and I'm going to talk about the young Turkish girl who was studying in London at Queen Mary, and how I met Graham and Uma. It was the Global Intellectual Property Policy class, and I was doing my master's many years ago. I'm not going to tell you how many years ago. I took that amazing class with Uma and Graham, And I learned a lot, and it's so interesting because I ended up working on global intellectual property policy. So, and Graham was my professor, but then he was my mentor, and he's a friend now. So, and it is such an honor to be here. And I have to say, it's not because Graham wrote the book, but I really, really love the book. You know, it is amazing. I mean, I try to do the same in my PhD research and in my book to talk about the history of pharmaceutical innovation and pharmaceutical industry. And I believe it's very interesting. And in my current job as an advocate, I need to tell stories. You know, the stories make difference in advocacy. And in this book, there are too many stories that we can tell. And, you know, one example is Gleevec. Graham had a slide about that. I've been working on Gleevec since like many years, since the Indian Supreme Court decision. Every year we made a submission to United States Trade Representative for Special 301 report, and we submitted comments. And like India section, we always have a, you know, explanation about Gleevec, the Gleevec case in the Indian Supreme Court. Now I know that I can just submit the, you know, the part from Graham's book, like read the story and learn. So it is really, really great. And I know that there are few advocates in the audience. I strongly encourage you to read the book and use it for your advocacy, because we need to tell these stories. So speaking about stories, and I see that there are some questions about the vaccines and how we can draw like parallels between past and the current situation. That's what I'm going to do, because I am the advocate in the audience. So it is very interesting when you read the book, and if you know a little bit about a pharmaceutical industry's history, there are so many things to learn from the history. And it's very important, as Graham mentioned, very important to know how we got here. So the current situation, we have vaccines, great, finally. But we have an access problem. Like many countries in developing world will not have the access to these vaccines before 2022, and there are even predictions that like it's 2024 for many of the many of the people living in the least developed countries. So the access problem is here, and when COVID-19 became a big thing in developed world, like it was around last March. You know, in January, February, we just ignored it was in China, so it wasn't our problem. And then in March, it became everyone's problem. We thought that was an opportunity for us to rethink about pharmaceutical industry and the current business model. But I have to say, we got crashed by the pharmaceutical industry and also powerful lobbyists. But you know, going back to the March 2020. So like the coronavirus, it wasn't a new virus. This is the third time the coronavirus leaped from animals to humans. So it's like first in SARS in 2002 and MERS in 2012, and finally, you know, COVID-19 in 2019. So this is the third time. We didn't have any medicines or vaccines against coronavirus. Why? Because there were no incentives. Even like, you know, the Johnson & Johnson's chief scientist said that, there was no real incentives because it was a disease for some people living in Asia and the Middle East, so they didn't invest. And we can really read that in Graham's book, because that has always been the case for pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry doesn't invest in infectious diseases. But then, you know, now like fast forward to now from March, everyone is talking about innovation. Everyone talking about incentives. Like the incentives, what are the incentives? The incentives were there. Coronavirus has been there since 2002, but it wasn't an incentive for pharmaceutical industry because there was no money, there was no market. Now, like, you know, from from March 2020 to now, like all the pharmaceutical companies have been working on coronavirus-related technologies, either diagnostic, treated medicines, or vaccines. And when you look at the when we look at the current vaccines, we see that, like, you know, mRNA vaccine, and Graham briefly talks about the mRNA technology in his book. And I have to say, the section about biotechnology is really amazing. Everyone should read that, like, because it provides you a very good insight into biotech medicines. Anyway, so mRNA vaccines, they prove to be the most effective ones, and given the current strains, like, they are the ones which work. And these vaccines, they came from small companies, because this is the reality of pharmaceutical innovation today. BioNTech and Moderna, these are not, like, you know, like the top pharmaceutical companies. These BioNTech and, I mean, now they became part, like, they joined the gang of big pharma, but they weren't. They were small biotech companies. And Graham talks about that, and he says that, like, usually the inventions, they come from these small biotech companies. But then, you know, big pharmaceutical companies, they either buy those companies or somehow, like, buy the inventions from those companies. And that's what happened with Pfizer vaccine. It's not Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer hasn't invested in this vaccine. It was BioNTech which invented the vaccine. But then Pfizer paid BioNTech. And, you know, there was a very interesting article in Der Spiegel with the CEO of BioNTech. And he said that, like, we really wanted to keep this as European innovation. But even with all the funding we received from the European Investment Bank and also the venture capitalists in Germany, we didn't have the capacity to go through all the regulatory approval process, which is a chapter in the book. That's really great. And also the distribution and manufacturing. So we partner up with Pfizer, and then it became Pfizer vaccine. Here in the US, no one talks about the biotech vaccine. It's the Pfizer vaccine. So that's how the innovation in pharmaceutical industry works. And it's interesting, Graham really distinguished between incentives in Europe and the US, and he mentions that in the US the situation is very different, because there is, like, a public funding of basic research, but there are also, like, venture capitalists. And when you look at the Moderna vaccine, you see this. You know, we call it as NIH Moderna vaccine because the National Institute of Health in the US played a very, very substantial role in development of that vaccine, and Moderna received, like, a public funding from the US government, but also venture capitalists. If you look at the stock market, the investors, they love Moderna. If you invested in Moderna in March, you tripled what you invested. So that's how the system works in the US, and it's a very interesting it's a very interesting observation, because you read the book and you're like, yeah, he's right. You know, this is exactly what happened with BioNTech and Moderna. So now that we have the problem, okay, I'm going to wear my access to medicines advocate hat. So we have the problem. We don't have enough manufacturing. And it's a chicken and egg problem, because, like, why we don't have enough manufacturing all those years, the policies, the international policies, the pharmaceutical companies pushed. But not only the pharmaceutical companies, but also the governments of these pharmaceutical companies ended up, like, lack of investment in developing countries. We built this system, this drug ecosystem or pharmaceutical ecosystem. You either rely on, like, big pharmaceutical companies, and if you're a developing country, you rely on Indian exports. So we have, like, lack of local manufacturing in many of developing countries. And it was IP policies, but it was also, like, you know, lack of thinking and, you know, seeing this issue as, like, as a part of innovation strategy, innovation policy. And so now we have the problem how to deal with that. There are discussions taking place at the World Trade Organization TRIPS Council. I mean, now it's in the General Council. Certain developing countries, India and South Africa, ask for the waiver of IP barriers because they say that, like, we really want to help ourselves, but as long as these IP, intellectual property barriers are there, we can't do that. Can we waive the IP protections related to COVID-19 technologies? There's huge pushback from the US, but also the EU. You know what? Because pharmaceutical industries, like the pharma lobbies, are very dominant. So, and Graham says in the book, and we ended up in a system, whatever is good for pharma, good for the country. And that's unfortunately the reality in the US. US trade policies are made according to the pharma's interests. So these discussions are taking place at the WTO TRIPS Council, and it sounds like it's the only game in town for many developing countries. So, as I said, this is a really great book. There are lots of stories to learn. And as an access to medicines advocate, I'm going to use these stories in my advocacy. And Graham read the last sentence of his book, but I'm going to read it again because it is an amazing. I mean, as you write a book, you know that last sentence is everything, and I think the book really summarizes, what it is all about. So the last sentence, and making the most beautiful medicine is all well and good, but if people who need it cannot get it to it for economic or other reasons, it might as well not exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brucia. And yes, you proved my point. You do. She always had strong views as well as a student, I can tell you. It's not new. Last speaker, but not least, of course, is Ken Chaplin, who's a professor of development studies at LSE and also the co-host, really, of this event. Ken, it's on to you.
Thanks, Uma, and thanks, Graham. It's great to be here. It's really a pleasure and an honor to participate in a panel on Graham's book and also to share the stage with you all, Uma, and Paul and Buju and Shiva. Let me just say before talking about the book that, I mean, Graham's always stood out for me as a bold and creative thinker. There's a world in which the same points are made over and over and over again. I mean, how many books and articles and theses have been written about the TRIPS agreement? You couldn't count them if you would, a supercomputer to count them all. But Graham never fails to bring new and different insights, and I think he's done it here again. I do think that this book is sort of I'll use the word intentionally, a masterful demonstration of how the pharmaceutical industry reflects what I guess you could call sort of a mutually reinforcing and interactive process of co-development between science, industry, and law. And by law, we have patent law and regulatory law. And I think it's great the way he puts this together. A key point in the book, it's implicit in a lot of the book, it's explicit at parts of the book, is that the pharmaceutical firms themselves are not simply bystanders in this process. Like, they're not just takers of this world, but they help shape this world. They contribute to the science. They contribute to the industry, and they also shape patent and regulatory law, both as it's designed and as it's implemented on the ground globally through their enormous political power and the resources they put into influencing things. There's lots of stuff in the book that I would love to talk more about: the role of pharma as a political actor, discussion of secondary patents and evergreening, the interaction between trademarks and patents, what this looks like in developing countries. Like Buju, I've been obsessed for a big part of my career with Gleevec, and would happy to talk about that. What I want to do is use the time that I have to address very briefly and very superficially the question in the title or the subtitle of what we can do about it. Specifically, what I think the lessons from the last year suggest about maybe how to improve the pharma innovation and access system. I'd like to say more about production and IP, but I won't have time. Before jumping to that, I just want to make a quick comment that, like, February of 2021, I think this seems like a strange time to be making some of our familiar criticisms that we often make about the pharmaceutical industry, the rate of innovation, or the Me Too aspects of innovation. I don't think anybody in the world would deny that the rate of innovation in the pharmaceutical industry in the last year has been nothing other than astounding, particularly with vaccines. Nobody would have expected that we would have multiple vaccines in less than a year. And with regard to vaccines, I just want to say that Me Too products is exactly what we need, and it's exactly what we want. We want alternative ways to go after the spike protein, for example, to generate immune responses. Similar mechanisms of action produced by different active substances is essentially almost the textbook definition of Me Too, and that's exactly what we need right now. If one company could, at the snap of a finger, produce 15 billion doses of a vaccine, that wouldn't be good enough. We actually need Me Too. And so I think that thinking about vaccines as Me Too products, which is something that we don't ordinarily do, should prompt us to question that entire concept and some of the ways like that we think about the industry. But let me just return to the what we can do about it question that's posed in the title, and in what ways I think the COVID response might provide some useful lessons. And here I'm basically gonna from 40,000 feet above sea level, talk about what I think some of the key features are of the COVID-19 innovation system. And in making these remarks, I'm going to draw on a paper, self-promoting here, a paper that I just published in Health Affairs with Bhavin Sampat by that exact same title. And so what do we see from 40,000 feet above sea level? We see really, really heavy roles for public funding for innovation. That's not new. We've always seen that. But much more oriented towards downstream activities than normal. So towards funding trials way more than normally, and for building up manufacturing, both paying the producers for manufacture, buying up space with contract manufacturers and so on. So it's a level of public funding on the downstream manufacturing side that we don't normally see. Much greater concern with production than usual, including facilitating collaboration among private actors, sometimes in ways that would normally be frowned upon by regulatory authorities. Clearly not enough of that, as we can talk about. Also, much more attention to vaccines than usual. The whole innovation system has been tilted heavily towards vaccines rather than therapeutics, which is different than the way it normally works. And much more of a reliance on commitment purchases as innovation incentives rather than patents and intellectual property rights per se, although the relationships among these are unclear. Were we to use a modified or improved version of the COVID-19 system and apply it going forward to sort of give us make it better, or however the subtitle of the book and the talk is, we would see much more coordination among the funders. So we're sort of pushing in a much wider variety of directions. More variation in vaccines of different utilities around the world, whether you're talking about the storage requirements or the number of doses that are needed, 1 dose versus 2 dose. Much more focus on treatments rather than so much of a focus just on preventatives. Much greater attention to diversity and delivery systems, whether it's about things that you inject or things that you put up your nose or tablets, that can be swallowed. And much more attention to both creating new products and repurposing existing molecules. And I would just say with the right incentives, perhaps addressing Paul's very, I think, right incremental innovation point about some of these trivial innovations actually not being trivial to their clinical effect, but with more there's an opportunity to think that there might be more downstream efforts to sort of push those along. The patent system may not be the right thing for that. And of course, we would see much more attention to production. I think everybody in the world who's watching the COVID-19 response right now says that, that is the principal problem. And so a modified version of what we've done in the last year would see a much greater public role downstream in manufacturing and a much larger sort of purchase requirements to encourage more firms to license more widely and to tap into production capacity more. I think that COVID has shown what we can do with the way it's sort of essentially build a new innovation system on the hoof. But I also think that it's been built on the hoof, and it could also shed light on what we could do a lot better to have a better pharmaceutical innovation system. I am actually going to stop there because you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear Graham, and there's 101 questions in the chat. And so I have a bunch more comments about production and IP and so on, but I'm going to save those for another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I'm actually going to hand it over to the panelists to answer questions. There are a lot of questions, but what has come up at least 2 or 3 times, other than COVID, and I think the COVID point has been covered very well by Ken, really, and his paper. I hope, Ken, you're posting your paper out on the Q&A, and also Buju. But another question that has come out is, what does the panel, what does Graham think about the phenomenon of AI changing the way pharmaceuticals and medicines are produced, especially when we think of it becoming a different sort of ecosystem, a non-human ecosystem?
Okay. Well, thanks for that question. I did see the AI question came out. I slightly sort of dreaded getting that question because next week I'm going to teach. Next week I'm going to teach a class on patents and new technologies, which I have to say something about AI, and I have no idea. I haven't started planning that class yet, so I've decided not to read anything about AI because I've got too many other things to read, and I'm going to start reading it next week. So if you ask me about 2 weeks' time, I'll probably be guaranteed to give you an answer. But this point that actually Shiva mentioned about biodigital convergence, clearly the ability to process and derive meaning from vast amounts of data is something that humans obviously can't do, human brain can't do alone. So AI is incredibly important, and I think actually it does suggest, as with the fact that other companies are muscling into the health sphere, is the sort of chemistry-based pharmaceutical industry is the centrality of the medicine, of the drug, of the chemical. Is it still going to be there, or is it going to be just one of a whole menu of health solutions that companies are going to provide? And data, of course, is incredibly important. There are a few other questions. I can't say too much. Ken said about Me Too's. Yeah, of course, incremental doesn't tell you anything about whether that increment is really important or trivial. Many will be trivial, some could be incredibly important. So yeah, how do you measure the sort of the contribution of a minor invention? Isn't something that there's no how do you measure that? It's not by the smallness or the bigness of the increment. It's some other factors obviously very important, and so variations on a theme shouldn't be sort of condemned just like that. I also Victor Edo said something about companies from outside of Europe, Cuba, the Finnish Institute in Cuba, and there's China and everything. Yeah, I do signal at the end that the geography of innovation, health, and I'm a geographer by background, is about to change hugely. Europe and North America is a lot of things are going to happen outside our continents. That's inevitable. That's going to happen. So so I do actually signal this as a change that is ongoing. Can I just say about innovation? We all use that word, and I think we should be a lot more careful how we use it. I mean, for me, innovation is not just what happens in the lab. It ends with an injection in somebody's arm. That is the end, because delivery is an important part of innovation. Innovation is not just what actually clever people do in the lab. That's, you could say it's a start or it's in the early stage, but the whole process, innovation is a process, and it only makes a difference when somebody actually has that. So I'll say no more, but of course COVID has been asked about as well. So, but others will have views on that. So I'll stop now.
Paul, Buju, I think for Paul, there was a question about expanding on morality versus legality argument.
Well, it's just, we can only expect businesses to follow the law. There's a lot of clever people involved in all of these areas of endeavor. and they're all looking to maximize their advantages. And we certainly cannot tolerate maximization through illegality, through fraud or other forms of illegal activity. But I think we have to be very careful about punishing or complaining about companies that, working within the laws, have tried to position themselves for advantage when we pay them to do that. The investors in those companies, the funders of those companies are paying for that. Their collaborators in the market, particularly in the US, things like the pharmacy benefit managers, are incentivized through their own profit motive to push for high prices. So this is not illegal activity, but I think it's fairly characterized as, in at least some context, immoral activity, particularly when you consider that you're hurting patients because of the delays that are incurred. You're hurting patients because of the access issues that are created. And there's so much public money funding all of this. And I would just say the key to my thinking is that public money has to demand more. If the public money doesn't demand anything for the investment, then they're getting what they deserve. And I can assure you, the venture capitalists make a lot of demands of the companies they invest in. I think the public should do the same. And I consider buying drugs a form of investment. I'm giving you money. You've done something. It's a little bit of a shift, but I'm still putting money in your pocket. I can make certain demands in return for that. But the moral ones are only going to take you so far. The financial ones are the ultimate drivers in the world that we've set up. I'm not even sure that that's a bad world.
Yeah, there's a really good point brought up by someone here in response also to Bruce, that pharmaceutical companies bring a lot more to their partnerships with small biotech. Basically, the know-how held as opposed to just pure money. Does the panelists have any other questions? Because I've been told to wrap up by 3:00 and we have 2 minutes to 3. Or else Graham is going to do his last plug by giving us 30% off, apparently. Are you? Graham, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, is that visible?
Yeah.
Yeah, 30%. Yes, I know the book. As well, people pointed out, the book is very expensive, and I know. And I did say I urged them to lower the price. So they did lower the price of the ebook, but I just could not get them to lower the price of the of the hardback, unfortunately. So it is, but there is a 30% discount from the website of the publishers. That helps. Every little helps.
Well,
sorry about this. I'm embarrassed at the price. Authors always are embarrassed at academic book prices.
Well, I think the next probably joint seminar might be there for about what do we do with the publishing industry.
I know.
Trying to make the pharma industry look good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But with that, I'm going to call this to a close. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along for this, and especially thanks to the panelists, Paul Fellner, Bruce Kiwi, Ken Chaplin, and Shiva Tambiceti, for taking the time out, especially the academics. I know it's a horrible online teaching term, so thank you for taking that, and to the American-based panelists for getting up really early. I mean, 8:30.
Thanks, Uma. Congratulations, Graham.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And thanks so much to all of you. And thanks for all the people who registered and joined. Thank you. Any questions?
It's a very good value for money, the book. Thank you.
Oh, you're too kind. Even at that price, you're too kind. Thank you.
Don't worry. The book and a bottle of champagne is on the way to you.
Thank you.